In the summer of 1987, a survey team working the cold water off the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula found a wreck sitting upright in 90 feet of Lake Superior, her hull nearly whole in water too cold and too dark for the worms and rot that finish off wrecks anywhere else on the continent. She had no name board left to read and no manifest left in her hold, only her cargo, laid out in the silt exactly as it had gone down. Not barrels of stamped ingots, not the refined copper the mining companies were shipping east by the ton in that decade. Raw masses of native copper, some the size of a fist, some as large as a man could lift, hammered and worked at the edges in a way no 19th century mining operation had any use for. A wreck that should have been carrying the ordinary freight of the copper rush was carrying something that belonged, by every mark on it, to a mining tradition that had already been finished for thousands of years before the ship that sank with it was ever built. The lake bed around her held nothing else out of place, no engine parts, no later debris drifted in from other losses, just the vessel and her cargo sitting in the same undisturbed configuration they had settled into on the night she went down. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The divers who found her had no reason to think they had found anything but another Superior wreck, one more name added to a lake that has swallowed hundreds of vessels and given almost none of them back. Lake Superior does that to ships in a way no other American water does. The cold near the bottom sits close to freezing year-round, too cold for the bacteria that eat wood and rope on a warm coast, so a hull can sit intact for a century while everything above the waterline in the Atlantic or the Gulf has long since collapsed into a debris field. Divers who work the lake regularly describe surfacing from a wreck feeling less like they have visited a ruin and more like they have walked through a room the owner stepped out of an hour ago. The team logged her as another unidentified schooner that first week, filed under a case number, and moved on to the next stretch of shoreline on their survey list. It was only later, when a conservator in Houghton laid the copper pieces out on a table and matched their hammer marks to tools pulled from pits on Isle Royale 7,000 years earlier, that the wreck stopped being a shipping accident and became a question nobody in the room could answer standing up. Long before any ship carried copper across Lake Superior, people were already taking it out of the ground on the shore above it. Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula hold the largest concentration of prehistoric copper mining anywhere on the continent. Thousands of pits, sunk into basalt ridges by people archaeologists now group under the name Old Copper Complex, ancestors of the Ojibwe and other Anishinaabe nations, who have lived on that shoreline since long before any of it needed a name written down. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal left behind in the pits push the earliest work back roughly 7,000 years, making it older than the pyramids, older than bronze casting anywhere in the Near East, older than almost any other sustained metalworking tradition on Earth that has left a record behind it at all. What made the region worth digging was not that the copper was abundant. Copper deposits exist elsewhere on the continent, scattered and thin. What made Lake Superior copper different was that it came out of the rock already metallic, in almost pure form, workable by hammer and fire alone, with no smelting required, and no furnace to build first. A miner who found a vein could cold hammer a nugget into a knife or a point the same afternoon, without the kilns, the bellows, or the ore roasting that every other early metalworking tradition in the world needed before it could turn stone into a blade. The pits themselves show a method suited to that fact. Fire built against the rock face to crack it, then doused with water so the sudden cooling split the stone further along its grain, then stone mauls, some weighing over 30 pounds, swung by hand to batter the loosened copper free from the seam. Thousands of those mauls have turned up in and around the pits over the past century and a half, worn smooth on one face from years of the same motion repeated by hands whose names were never recorded anywhere. Wooden shovels and bowls used to bail water out of the deeper pits have survived as well, preserved in the same waterlogged, oxygen-poor ground that kept the ancient wooden cribbing intact for thousands of years before any of it saw daylight again. When copper prospectors returned to the region in the 1840s, chasing the same deposits for an industrial market that had no idea it was following in anyone's footsteps, they kept walking into pits that were already there. Entire hillsides on Isle Royale turned out to be pocked with shallow depressions overgrown by trees 2 and 3 centuries old, root systems grown directly through backfill that had not been disturbed since the ancient miners left it. Inside more than one of those pits, prospectors found masses of copper still sitting where the ancient work had left them, propped on wooden cribbing that had somehow survived buried underground for millennia, lifted partway out of the rock and then abandoned, for reasons nobody left behind ever explained. One block on Isle Royale weighed close to 6 tons, resting on timber supports built to move it and never used. The 19th century crew that found it could not lift it either. They mined around it and left it exactly where it lay, the way it had been left the first time, a monument to an effort nobody could finish twice. The scale of what had been worked became the second problem, and it is the one that never fully resolved. Mining engineers surveying the district in the 1860s and 70s, cataloguing pit after pit along a belt running nearly 100 miles from the tip of the Keweenaw down through the Ontonagon country, produced running estimates of total ancient extraction that climbed into the hundreds of millions of pounds, with some contemporary tallies pushed considerably higher still. Those figures have been argued over for a century and a half, revised downward by cautious researchers and defended upward by others working from the same raw pit counts, and the argument is not really about whether people mined here at that scale. The pits are still there to count, still visible on modern LiDAR surveys of the island's ridgelines, still showing up in university theses that recount them one more time. The argument that has never been settled is about where all of that copper actually went. Finished copper from this tradition does turn up across the continent, and it turns up far from Lake Superior. A cemetery excavated at Oconto, Wisconsin, produced copper points and awls buried with people who lived centuries before the pyramids, and burial mounds tied to the later Hopewell tradition in Ohio have yielded sheet copper worked into ornaments and effigies, hundreds of miles from any deposit that could have supplied the raw metal on its own. Further finds along the Mississippi and its tributaries, some catalogued in state collections that have never been fully cross-referenced against one another, extend that same distribution even farther, into regions that had no copper of their own, and no reason to acquire it except through people willing to carry it a long way on foot or by canoe. That distance is itself the evidence of a working exchange network, one that moved raw and finished copper south and east for centuries before anyone on this side of the ocean used the wheel or fired a kiln. But the volume recovered archaeologically, added up across every excavated cemetery and mound attributable to that era, comes nowhere close to matching the volume the mining surveys describe as removed from the ground. A gap that size, between what was demonstrably taken out of the earth and what has ever been found again in a museum drawer or an excavation report, is the kind of number that should have closed a debate rather than started one. It never closed. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. A handful of metallurgists in the 20th century took the gap seriously enough to test it directly. A University of Michigan researcher named Elias Vandermeer led one of the more thorough comparisons, matching the trace lead and arsenic signatures locked into Lake Superior copper against Bronze Age copper artifacts recovered in parts of the eastern Mediterranean, on the reasoning that a metal's trace chemistry is close to a fingerprint of the ore body it came from and travels with the object no matter how far it is carried or how many hands it passes through on the way. Vandermeer's early results, presented at a regional conference in the 1950s, showed a partial overlap in several samples close enough that his own notes described it as worth a larger study, one he requested funding for twice and was refused both times on the grounds that the comparison fell outside the department's established research priorities. The results were treated as inconclusive by the institutions that reviewed them and were never pursued past a first round of limited publication, not disproven so much as set down and left where no one was required to look at them again. What the comparison would require, if it held up under wider testing with a larger sample, is a transatlantic exchange of raw metal centuries before any voyage the accepted record allows for, which is exactly the kind of requirement that gets a promising result filed rather than followed to a conclusion anyone has to defend. The environment that swallowed this question had its own history, and it did not begin with the copper. In 1894, the Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology published a report under the archaeologist Cyrus Thomas, concluding that the earthwork mounds scattered across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys had been built by the ancestors of the very nations still living near them, not by a vanished race of mysterious mound builders, as an earlier generation of amateur writers had insisted for decades. The finding itself was correct, carefully argued, and it corrected a genuinely harmful myth that had been used for years to justify treating living nations as strangers standing on their own ancestral ground. But the institutional appetite that finding left behind ran in one direction only, toward folding every anomalous find into an explanation that required no unfamiliar builder, no unresolved timeline, and no further funding to chase down. A gap of hundreds of millions of pounds of unaccounted copper did not fit that appetite, and proposals that raised it quietly stopped being commissioned, one field season at a time, until nobody working inside the institutions was submitting them at all. The pit counts and the tonnage estimates kept circulating anyway, but almost entirely outside the peer-reviewed record, passed between regional historians and mining engineers, rather than argued out in any journal built to settle the question properly. The physical evidence took its own separate damage on a different track entirely. 19th-century mining companies working the same ground the ancient miners had worked treated the old pits as an obstacle standing between them and the ore, something to clear rather than something to record, and the ones that were not simply blasted through were rarely mapped with any consistency before the crews and equipment moved further down the ridge chasing the next vein. A company surveyor working the Minong Ridge in the 1870s noted in a single surviving letter that his crew had cleared through roughly 40 ancient pits in one season alone, without a formal record kept of any of them, because the schedule did not allow for it, and nobody above him had asked for one. He mentioned the wooden tools and the 6-ton block almost as an aside, worth a paragraph in a personal letter to his brother, but never worth a line in anything the company itself filed, and it is only because that letter survived in a family collection rather than a corporate archive that any account of that season exists at all. Ledgers from that era survive today only in fragments, held by regional historical societies and a handful of private collections, most never formally catalogued by any larger state or federal archive. Several lost outright when small-town historical societies changed hands, ran out of funding, or burned in the ordinary way small wooden buildings tend to. One surviving fragment belongs to a mine clerk named Corwin Aldrich, who worked the Keweenaw docks through the height of the copper boom and kept a private shipping ledger alongside the company one his job actually required him to fill out, apparently because he found the copper coming off the docks more interesting than the freight manifests he was paid to record. In an entry dated October of 1863, held today by a historical society in Holton, among a box of otherwise unremarkable dock records, Aldrich noted a private charter taking on what he called raw stock copper, purchased off a collector rather than issued by any mining company, bound for a buyer back east whom his own ledger never names, and describes only as a gentleman from Boston with an interest in curiosities. Aldrich added a line beneath the entry, half apology and half pride, noting that he had counted the pieces himself before they went aboard, because the collector selling them seemed unwilling to let anyone else near the crates. and that the collector had refused a fair offer from a second buyer in Detroit the week before, holding out specifically for the unnamed man in Boston. The vessel he described, by tonnage and rig, matches the wreck found in 1987, closely enough that the Historical Society now lists Aldrich's ledger alongside the dive survey in its own catalogue, the two records filed side by side for the first time in over a century of sitting apart in different buildings. If Aldrich's entry describes the same voyage, then the wreck sitting in 90 feet of water off the Keweenaw is not simply a shipping accident from an ordinary bad season on the lake. It is a shipment of copper already ancient when it went into the hold, gathered by a collector whose name never made it into any surviving ledger, being sent east toward a buyer who is just as unnamed, on a ship that went down in a storm before whatever question that buyer meant to ask about it could ever be answered by anyone at all. The record was not suppressed by any single decision made in any single office. It simply never left the lake. Isle Royale is a national park today, its ancient pits protected under federal law rather than mined for anything further, walked over each summer by hikers who mostly have no idea what the shallow depressions beneath their boots actually represent. The wreck itself sits exactly where the divers found her, catalogued now as a protected historic site under Michigan law, her cargo left largely undisturbed on the working theory that a hold full of unprovenanced ancient copper tells researchers more sitting in the cold mud where it was found than it ever would sitting catalogued in a museum drawer somewhere far from the water that kept it. Corwin Aldrich's ledger is available today to anyone who asks a staff member to see it, one line among hundreds of ordinary dock entries, describing a shipment nobody in a century and a half has ever been able to finish tracing to either end. What the wreck actually proves is narrower than everything it suggests, and that difference is worth being honest about rather than smoothing over for the sake of a clean ending. It proves that raw, unsmelted copper matching a 7,000-year-old mining tradition was still being gathered, sold, and shipped as late as the American Civil War, long after most historians assumed that particular trade had quietly ended centuries earlier. It does not prove where the rest of the missing copper went in the centuries before that, or who the buyer waiting on the far end of Aldrich's voyage actually was, or what he already knew that made him willing to pay a collector rather than a mining company for it. The lake has kept that part for itself, the way it has kept so much else pulled beneath its surface, cold and dark and sitting exactly as it was the day it went under. Every diver who has visited her since has come back with the same description: a hold still full, a question still open, and a cargo that has now sat waiting longer underwater than it ever sat waiting on the dock at Keweenaw, patient in a way nothing on land ever manages to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.